It's another episode of Tech Girl Talks, and I've explained this so many times before, but if you're new to the YouTube channel, I'm going to do it all over again. This is actually a live conversation that I have on Twitch every Wednesday at 1 p.m. SAST. I then edit the VOD and upload it here to YouTube so that you can watch in case you missed it. Today, we are talking about why gaming is so toxic and why certain gaming communities have so much toxicity in them. Each of these episodes, we discuss various issues, and I'll drop some cards in this video to some of our past episodes. We're all esports lovers. This is a positive space. So we'll be talking about toxicity and then also talking about some of the solutions we can possibly use to try and alleviate it. That's the conversation you get to watch. And before you begin, I do want to say a big shout out to Vermaas from Goliath Gaming. He is their mental coach. He is also studying to be a psychologist, and he really helped me with a lot of insights. His thoughts and his views are included in the VOD. So make sure you listen. And of course, if you like it, let me know in the comments, but we'll get to that at the end of this. Let's watch. Episode 5 of Tech Girl Talks. We're going to be talking specifically about why gaming is so damn toxic. But before we get into that, I just want to say a big thank you to all of you who've stayed with me for the last 4 episodes. This started off as something I just wanted to do for fun, and it's really become something I've enjoyed so much, and I'm really grateful to each and every one of you. And I appreciate your time here. Toxicity in gaming is such a difficult topic because it is so broad. There is so much that needs to be broken down. So for this episode, we're going to keep it pretty broad because I kind of want to introduce what toxicity actually is, why we see so much of it in gaming, and then talk a little bit more about some of the solutions that are on offer. And I'm hoping that if this goes well and there's a good response, we'll deep dive into this even more, and it should be interesting. Before I begin, though, I want to be very clear with this specific topic. I do not condone racism. I do not condone sexism, bigotry, or any form of hate and malicious intent. And while a lack of knowledge in certain instances can explain this type of behavior, the majority of the time we see this horrible vitriol online, it is at the highest level, and there is absolutely no excuse for it. Be it in gaming, be it in social media. In these instances, and I want to be clear from the get-go, it is my stance that these gamers should be banned from playing the game, they should be kicked out of tournaments, and they should be completely excluded from the community. No questions, no discussions. That's where I stand on that. But I do understand that toxicity goes a little bit deeper than that. And sometimes toxicity isn't necessarily linked to racism or sexism or homophobia. It could just be that you're an angry person. So we're going to kind of break that down and explain a little bit more today. And I'm hoping at the end of this, we have a little bit more insight into why gaming seems to breed such a toxic culture. I want to discuss toxicity in gaming. I want to talk about not only what I consider absolute hate speech and horrible stuff, but I also do want to talk a little bit about the toxicity that we feel when sometimes people say mean things or things like that, and we've all got examples. It's interesting because when I started the research for this episode, I actually was reading up, and there's a study from the Anti-Defamation League. So they interviewed a bunch of different gamers, and they found that 80% of the players interviewed had experienced some form of toxicity online in a game or the likes. This behavior is extremely prevalent in gaming, this toxic behavior, this anger, and it's a topic that comes up frequently. We see it so much. We see so much of it online, and there's so many examples. I have my own examples. Just last week, I was doing a stream here. I was doing Tech Girl Talks and talking about the LGBTQ community in gaming and esports. And someone came into the chat, a random human we don't know, doesn't follow, and proceeded to make a really underhanded comment about the size of my forehead and my nose. I think the comment was something along the lines of, it's so impressive to see how confident you are considering the size of your forehead and your nose. And that's a form of toxicity because that person immediately was obviously banned. And what was interesting is I have never been I'm self-conscious about a lot of things about my body and my face, but the size of my forehead and my nose has not been one of them. And at the time I read it and I thought, look at this horrible person saying these horrible things. And we laughed about it in the chat, and I left and laughed about it. And then about 2 days ago, I looked in the mirror without even consciously thinking it, I was doing something and I was like, wow, my forehead's so big. And I suddenly realized that thought had come from the toxicity I'd experienced in the chat. I've experienced much worse. That's just one example of someone getting their kicks from being mean. And it's mean, but it's not illegal. It's not hate speech. It's just someone being horrible, right? And we've all experienced it. We've all had to deal with this in some way. But it does go further. I've experienced immense toxicity in esports from not just... Actually, I've had some bad experiences with like fans in the Twitch chat, but the worst experiences I've had is with people I've had to work with behind the scenes. Horrible toxicity from them. But I want to talk about gaming specifically. We've all been in a game. I've been in a game where someone said something sexist. But outside of that, I've been in a game where someone's just started screaming at me because I haven't necessarily performed the way they felt. Or someone has got super aggressive for no reason, or just started being really mean for no reason. And you see this all the time. And toxicity, it lives in gaming. And this is a tough one for me because I get interviewed a lot in media, and we see all these conversations around esports and gaming, and it is a question that comes up a lot because for most people, I would argue, like that Anti-Defamation League survey said, about 80% of people who've played online have experienced it. I have friends who would never call themselves gamers, who have decided to play a game of Warzone during lockdown with their friends, and they've come on and someone started swearing at them, and that's their first gaming experience, is just being sworn at and told how stupid they are, and they kind of go, whoa, like this is a bit aggressive, and it's something that we see so much. So I was curious because I was like, why is there so much toxicity in gaming? Why does it seem to be a space where, and not only in game, not only in online multiplayers, why is it that Reddit is just, any gaming conversations in Reddit turn into horrible conversations? Why is it that live stream chats on big broadcasts and things like that are so angry and so vicious? Why is there so much toxicity? Why do people actively seek out other gamers to shout at and be mean to and hurt? And I don't really have the answer. So I thought today I would get someone who's a little bit more qualified to talk to us. So his name is Stephen Vermaas. I actually grew up with him. So he is a mental coach for a South African gaming organization called Goliath Gaming. And he's also doing, if I'm not mistaken, his master's in psychology because he'd like to be a qualified psychologist. And he has spent a lot of time studying and looking into gaming because that's his passion and understanding the mental effects of it. So what I thought today was that we would chat a little bit to Stephen to get his insights, and then you'll also be able to share your insight. But the first question that I decided to ask him was straight out there. I said, Stephen, please explain to me, why is there so much toxicity in gaming?
So much toxicity in gaming, not only in-game, but also on platforms like Reddit and Twitch, etc. Look, I think with the toxicity, this is it's a broad and it's a big topic. So I think there's going to be a lot of different factors at play, and I think, as we can all imagine, there would be a lot of things that could happen within a person personally, or even just within social situations that would give rise to toxicity. Which, like, I mean, I take it here we're just going to how would I say toxicity just to be any disrespectful or like malicious behavior towards others. So I think some noteworthy factors that are going on here. I think a big one is beyond toxicity that we see online is just the anonymity behind being online. I think that thing of us all just being detached, almost disguised by just being online and having hidden identities and being so just detached from our typical in-person types of contact with people, that almost like opens the door for us to just almost like allow the worst of us to show or to come out. And I think why that is because we don't face the same like repercussions we would for behaving that way with people around us in our community, in our family and stuff, that we would see again. Because there you would have these recurring interactions with people, and there you would almost feel like I said, the repercussions of your actions in that sense. So I think from that distance and how detached we are online, I think that's one of the things that gives rise to that. Some other factors that I think are really big within online gaming is the age of gamers typically. Gamers are between are in their teen years and early 20s. And as like some of us older ones will know, these are not the years in which we do our finest decision making. So it's, I think maturity becomes a factor in that sense. I think when we're younger, a lot of us haven't almost developed that. How would I say that? The self-awareness and stuff, or even just the self-awareness to care for our actions and what we say and almost like what we put out into the world and just things of that nature. And I think the self-control being another element there. I think a lot of the surrounding toxicity is the emotion that underpins it, or always it seems to be anger, So I think another thing that's in play is a lot of us, unfortunately, never really being taught or not knowing how to handle our anger and our aggression and stuff. And like I say, when it comes out in online things, rather unmediated platform, then it's we tend to just not have to go through the harder route of breathing it through, of calming ourselves down, of actually working through anger and stuff like that. It almost always feels easier to just put that blame on someone else elsewhere, even if it's our own mistake or our own faults that landed us up being angry in the first place. Some other things that I think would play within the online communities and maybe a bit broader than obviously applicable to in-game, but also outside of that is I think there's some group psychology or social psychology things that are at play. Anytime you have like an in-group and an out-group setup, this can be like a my team versus your team, left versus right, red versus blue, us versus them. Anytime you have this type of setup, it makes it almost evokes a certain batch of biases in us. Biases obviously against our opposition or our perceived opposition, and a bias in favor of our views and stuff. So I mean, you couple us having a couple of these biases with things like echo chambers and stuff being the result of just how algorithms are set to what you're going to be exposed to on social media sites and things of that nature. It's almost like it almost provokes a lot of us versus them type thinking, and you can see how things like that can contribute towards bringing up hostility in people. But yeah, so I mean, I think this is obviously a dense topic, so I mean, I really like the question, but I think those are some nice points to leave for now.
As Stephen mentioned, it's a very dense topic, and there's so much more to it that you can really break down. And I think that you could probably go on for an hour really breaking into what the psychological studies say. But for now, I think he's recapped it very nicely. Stephen wrapped up and summarized why we see so much toxicity in game. And I think, like he mentioned, it's really difficult. So there's lots of different factors. It can be the fact that no one knows who you are. There's no repercussions when you're behind a screen. It can be the fact that it's your age and you just don't know any better. Maybe you just, you didn't know that was not the way to behave. Or it could just be that you've got all this pent up anger inside and that's what you're throwing out there. Your own psychological issues. I know that we try and avoid this at all costs, and we fought for a long time to say gamers are not lonely humans in their basements. We're very social creatures. But I do think that plays a role. I think that you become less inclined to, if you're spending all your time at home in front of a screen, which we all are at the moment because of COVID and lockdown, you're less inclined to realize those social interactions and read people and understand how you're making them feel. So sometimes you don't even realize you're being toxic. You could be, and this has happened to me, and I'm sure it's happened to you when you're in a game, especially in online multiplayer sometimes. And it happened to me a few months ago, and it's something that's sat with me for a while. Is you're playing and maybe you're not as good as everyone else, but it turns out everyone else has got quite competitive all of a sudden, and maybe you aren't as competitive. Maybe you're just there having fun, and that competitive group starts getting angry because you're not doing what they need you to do to win the game. You're maybe there for a very different reason, and then sometimes they'll start shouting, maybe not even shouting, but in fact, not shouting, just saying, you need to be here, you need to do this. Why did you miss that shot? What are you doing? And you're immediately finding yourself falling in. They're not being toxic. They're not purposefully being toxic, and it's not toxic if they're saying, why are you doing this? But then eventually over time, the conversation starts to become quite difficult, and maybe they'll pass a comment like, you need to practice more, or you need to do this, or that was absolutely useless, or my favorite is looking for team in chat. Well, that isn't toxic in the sense of being sexist or racist or homophobic or being outright mean. It is somewhat toxic, and you don't realize that when you say stuff like that, you're actually hurting the other person. It happened to me recently where I kind of went, oh, I don't play this game anymore. I used to love playing this game. I don't play it anymore. Like, I don't want to get into this situation where I feel this like anger from my teammates if I'm not delivering. I came here to play for fun. This isn't cool. And I don't like these people anymore. It's not that I don't like that. I don't like playing with them anymore because I want to be shouted at. This is my downtime. It's not necessarily toxic, but for the most part, it creates a toxic environment. One of the other things that I think happens, and we saw it mentioned in the chat there about being the loudest voice, is that I've seen social groups start to mimic one another, and it was mentioned there by Stephen about why do we see this toxicity, and that is because sometimes we start to mimic behavior of the people we're playing with. So if you surround yourself with someone that is quite aggressive and mean in game, who likes to bant, you know the bants, which we all love to do. It's a competitive game where, I'm going to talk from my own experience in first-person shooters. I'm playing a game where the objective is to shoot the other player in the head. It's pretty aggressive to begin with. So there is a little bit of aggression, and then you shoot them in the head and you make your joke. And sometimes, though, you see certain players maybe push the banting too far, like the bants. They can get... They're very funny, so they start pushing these comments out because it makes their teammates laugh. And they're saying things in the chat or in voice that are actually quite toxic and mean, but everyone's laughing, and that social validation is really great. So everyone else is laughing. Am I being horrible and mean and personal to someone? Yes, but everyone else is laughing. I'm never going to deal with this person. I'm doing it in a text chat. I'll probably never see them again. But all these people that I'm playing with are laughing. They think I'm cool. We all feed off that attention, right? So that's the first thing that happens. The other thing that I've seen happen is... I actually saw this with my own eyes. I was playing with someone who was about 15, 16. And we were in a game with very, very toxic teammates that we'd found online. And they got quite aggressive with my friend because he happened to be extremely good at the game. He was the top fragger. He was doing well. So they started team killing him, which is toxic behavior. And when they were doing it, they were writing some personal mean things in the chat. And at the time, he went very quiet, so I can only presume that it was upsetting him. But we exited the game, and we went and found another game. And when we moved into the other game, one of those toxic players from the last game was there. And the first thing my teammate did was go and shoot him in the head, and then write horrible things in the chat. Why? Well, because it had happened to him, and it hurt. So his way of dealing with it was simply to mirror that behavior so that he could get the same reaction from the other person. I have done this. I'm not proud. I've done similar things where when people have got toxic with me, I get a lot of sexist comments online. When people get sexist with me, I immediately respond with extremely toxic, mean things because I want them to hurt the same way I'm hurting. And I do think that also plays a role. I think there's lots of things when it comes to toxicity that we can delve into, and it isn't just one thing in a vacuum. But I do think that plays a role as well. Is I hurt, now you must hurt too. And also sometimes it does come down to attention. You're in this group of people and they think you're funny. And the more you're throwing your banter out there, the more they're laughing. So the more you do it and the more you do it, and eventually you cross the line and you don't even realize you've crossed the line because you're just so desperate to be included in the group. We're social. Humans are social. That's how we behave. It doesn't justify it though. And this for me is really important, is sometimes when we fall into that toxic behavior, we're not even aware we're doing it, and we have to be. Maybe it's because you got extremely serious about the game and you want to take it competitively and your teammates aren't, and that's frustrating. Maybe you just don't like the person you're playing with. That happens sometimes. You get into a game and someone's on the voice chat and they're annoying you and you get angry. Maybe you just had the absolute worst day at work and you get online and someone just bugs you. And so you behave in a toxic manner. So while we talk about toxicity in gaming here, I'm not going to focus on the extreme versions where it becomes full-on sexism, racism, bigotry. I mentioned, for me, that is an out-and-out ban. Player must be gone. No discussion, nothing. But when it comes to the more nuanced toxicity, where it's just someone being mean or trying to make people laugh without understanding that because it's a screen and not seeing what's on the other side, not understanding the damage they're doing, that's still bad. It's still not something that we can condone. Because sometimes we fall into that toxic behavior for whatever reason. And when I say toxic behavior, I'm talking about the shouting at someone, saying something about their mom. I want to be clear that when I'm talking about toxicity, I'm talking about the nuanced toxicity of maybe passing some toxic comments in a chat, maybe swearing at someone. When it comes to out and out hate speech, sexism, racism, homophobia, like I mentioned, I absolutely refuse point blank to accept it. The player must be banned. But for some of those other things, I mean, we've seen jokes about your mom and things like that. Those things happen. And I was curious, and I've seen so many people in the chat mentioning, that they've done similar things, is when you fall into that space where you're starting to be toxic, where you've crossed the line and you've identified it, what can you do? This for me is really important. If you know that there's a trigger that angers you to the point that you tilt and you may say something, not offensive, but say something mean in a way that could hurt someone, how do you correct that? Once again, I want to be clear, there is no way to justify sexism, racism, homophobia. When we're talking about toxicity, we're talking about that stuff where, someone team kills you, or someone's just like being very toxic where they're shouting in the mic to annoy you, things like that. That's what I'm focusing on here, because I think going into the harder stuff is completely different conversations, which we will have. But for now, I wanted to talk about, if you realize that you're a little bit toxic, maybe you're that teammate that shouts at everyone else all the time and you don't even realize it, stuff like that. How do you fix that? Can you fix that? So I thought I'm going to ask Stephen again, the psychologist, the trainee psychologist we're speaking to. And I said to him, well, if I realize that I'm behaving in a toxic manner, how do I stop?
For someone who has realized they contribute to this toxicity, what can they do to try and heal or improve their behavior? And I really like this question. It made me picture like someone having the self-realization of like, oh wait, I'm toxic. How do I cleanse myself? Like what do they do about it? So, look, I don't know the answer, but just to give like a possible, a suggestion for a starting point would almost be to just follow that realization into some introspection as to like why you were so reactive to that situation. You could almost ask yourself like, why did that make me so mad, or what, like, where did all that anger come from in that thing? And maybe like two potential branches it could come from. Maybe you find like the answer something like that's leaving you frustrated, or that's just got you feeling like just tense from outside in life, if you're going through rough times, or going through fights or conflicts with other people, or if there's conversations you're not having, or work that you should be doing or can't be doing, or can't get to, or aren't getting to. All these types of things can get us like can leave us feeling on edge and reactive and trigger more easily. There's also like a whole bunch of factors that pertain like more like to in-game stuff, like when people are however consciously trying to improve and really get after things, and how invested people feel in the results and the outcomes of games and stuff like that. And there's always a clash if you have some taking seriously someone playing for some for fun, some are playing with friends, some are trying new things. Like just sometimes I think you're going to get some degree of conflict in motivations or between types of people. Um, in that sense. But like I say, to just almost ask that question, like, what is like, where's all that anger coming from? Then the next type of or batch of things we might want to think about is like, okay, so what if that answer, what if that moment when we do feel angry, or we do tilt, we do trigger, or we do find ourselves wanting to hit that toxic message and hit enter, whatever the case, like, what do we do from there? And I think this one's almost speaking to how we deal with anger and those stronger emotions in that sense. And I think a lot of us, unfortunately, never really learned or got taught how to deal with anger and those types of things. So, like I say, when it comes out in these online platforms and it's rather unmediated or removed from repercussion, I think, like, our anger and stuff really does get the best of us. But there's coping mechanisms that we can adopt to just help us regulate there in games, and these things are much more practical. I would say a big one here is that if you've had this realization, then you can make it a conscious goal or conscious point to yourself that you want to be more positive. That you want to be less toxic, either side of the coin, however you want to phrase that. Like, but almost that once you've had that as a conscious decision or conscious goal for yourself to do that, then when you're in the game and you find you catch yourself being toxic or whatever, at least you have the chance of that realization, that thing coming, like, no, I want to stick to my goal, I want to have, that thought pops in your head, and then your willpower can say no, like, like, don't hit into essentially on those types of things. Or another type of one would just be to have some form of process of centering yourself. Like I say, it might be that's where you need to just take the couple deep breaths like that, remind yourself that you're gonna, that you not letting things like that affect you as much, or that you've made that conscious decision to yourself. And I think another key piece between that would be for gamers is that after that game or after a game, to actually just have some time, a couple minutes to almost to de-stress or to let it go, sometimes to just to blow it over like that, and essentially in those couple minutes before you just insta-queue get into the next, it's just like to have a couple minutes to think about, like, okay, what went wrong, how did it get to that point that I was like that, and almost like extract whatever lesson you need to from that, and then make a conscious thing to leave it in the past or let that one go. And then that way you're going into the next game at least not with the baggage of the previous one, because that's that's almost a surefire way to make sure you're going to come in flaming off the bat. Like, so I would say things like that. So just having and starting to build that centering thing for yourself. These days there's all the fuss about yoga and meditation and mindfulness, and there's again many different avenues to the thing. But I think another way of phrasing it would be just that it's some way of regulating your emotions. You're feeling that intense anger and stuff, you want to bring yourself back down to that calm. So, like, what can you do? And I think the deep breath will always be it's always going to top or rank fairly highly on that list, given that it has clear physiological perks that are well researched and supported in that sense, and it also helps with a form of psychological centering. So I think those would be those things. But a personal thing for me that I always used to find really beneficial was just having that couple minutes in between the game. If you're really starting to, get healthy with it, then that's your time to stand up, stretch, walk around, go outside for a little bit, do whatever, literally shake it off if you need to, and then get back in for the next one.
Coming from the chat, the idea that people tie their value as a person to how good they are at the game is very true. And I do think that also breeds a certain amount of toxicity, because when you're playing in a multiplayer environment, there's a lot of frustration if your value is that important. So maybe it's more than fun for you. Maybe you want to get picked up by a team. Maybe you do tie your value to it. You'll immediately get more aggressive. You'll get more angry. And that anger leads to you, sometimes, if you don't know how to handle it, behaving in not such a good way. And like we mentioned earlier as well, a lot of toxicity, people don't even realize they're doing it. So toxicity is not just maybe tilting and getting angry. Toxicity is also where you think you're being funny. I've seen this so much in games and we did speak about it earlier, where you think you're being funny. So you're making these funny comments, but you don't realize that a lot of your comments are actually really mean and they're hurting the person on the other side. You think you're being funny, your teammates are laughing at you, that emboldens you, so you make more comments, but the other person is feeling very hurt. And a lot of your comments are actually quite toxic and you don't even see it. So those are all things that apply. Once again, of course, there's a whole other level of toxicity, which is unexcusable. Anything condoning hate speech, like we've said, that's just a get out, game over, we don't want to hear about it. But for a lot of us, we do have these behaviors that Stephen mentioned. And I think that the biggest thing that we possibly need to look at is also understanding and remembering that it is just a game. Whether you're I understand when you're competitive, there's money involved in esports, it becomes about money. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to you're meant to be having fun. And if you're not having fun, if you're getting so angry that you have to lash out at a stranger on the other side of a screen and get aggressive with them and be offensive and shout, I think at that point you need to step back and, like Stephen said, get off the computer and maybe have a look at yourself. And I do think that this is actually an interesting conversation because we're talking about toxicity in gaming, but we should probably talk about toxicity in esports because it gets far worse when we move into the esports realm. And I do believe, when I say far worse, you don't see people shitting on each other in an esports game when you're watching it, but you see a lot of it behind the scenes, a lot of that toxicity. And that also has to do with when we talk about tying your value to a game, your value is intrinsically linked to that game because you need to earn prize money. We're talking about toxicity. This is a live chat. While it's happening, you see someone come into this chat, someone who's trying to give us an example of, I suppose, what toxicity looks like, but super aggressive, super mean, clearly from South Africa because used some South African swear words. But this is something that happens all the time. Now, that person came here simply to have a go at me for whatever reason. And this is something that we see all the time. Completely anonymous. Just wanted to see me react and potentially get upset and angry. Just wanted to make me angry. And I do think in instances like that, because that person didn't say anything homophobic, racist, or sexist, was just being mean. I think in an instance like that, that person comes into the conversation to be toxic and say something toxic to me because they want to see me hurt and angry. And I do think that that's because they're just very hurt and angry for whatever reason. They're just miserable in their lives. And this is the thing that Stephen was talking about, is sometimes the toxicity comes from your own psychological issues. Those are things that you have to address. Also, sometimes that could have been a conversation where all their friends were in a WhatsApp group and they were, for whatever reason, someone was like, oh, look at this XYZ doing this chat, we don't like them. Comes in here to say that, screen grabs it, shows it to their friends, and they get a kick out of it. And this was what Stephen was mentioning, why do we get a kick out of it? Well, because psychologically, we're not in a happy place. So for some reason, making others miserable makes us feel more accepting of our misery. Or it is a social situation where you potentially think you look cool when you come in and you say stuff like that. This, for me, though, is meant to be a positive space. So Tech Girl Talks is meant to be a positive space. And what I want from this is, I'm not going to sit here and show a million examples of toxicity. Even when they're coming into the chat and giving me the opportunity live, I'm also not going to sit here and try and break down why someone is toxic. I want to give you solutions. So the first thing that obviously we broke down is why there is so much toxicity in gaming. Then we got Stephen to speak a little bit about if you identify that maybe you have a problem for whatever reason, whether it be that mentally you're just miserable, maybe it's a social thing, maybe you're just a very angry person, maybe you're just jealous because you feel like someone is really good at a game and you're not, or someone can sit here and talk about things and you can't. For whatever reason, if you've identified that you have a toxic trait, Stephen did share some things on how we fix that and then how you can find ways to better yourself once you've identified it. But I also wanted to speak to him a little bit about how you deal with being a victim of toxicity. And this was something that again, I mentioned this earlier on. This advice is relating directly to what we just saw happen, where someone will come into the chat and say horrible things to you that aren't necessarily hate speech, they're just horrible. How do you deal with that? When it comes to sexist, racist, and homophobic comments, that's a conversation for a different time, and I'll get into it. But for this, I kind of said to Stephen, well, if someone's being toxic, and it's like I said at the start, where last week someone came into the chat and made some really mean comments about the size of my forehead and my nose, which was something I'd never been self-conscious about. And yet, straight after that, when I went in to, straight after, like a couple of days later, when I went and looked in the mirror, I felt really uncomfortable and realized that that was the effect of the toxicity that I had experienced in the chat. So without even mentally realizing it, I'd taken on this thing where I'm suddenly very aware of the fact that apparently I have a big forehead, which I think my forehead's fine. But at the time, I had this moment where I was like, oh, maybe I do. And I was like, how do you deal with that when you're putting up with it time and time again? We're seeing it now in my live chat where it's just coming up time and time again. And it's how do you deal with this? How do you cope with that? So this was something that I put to Stephen. Of course, like I said, he's the mental coach for Goliath Gaming, currently studying psychology. And I said to him, well, how do you cope if you're having to deal with this hate? If you're having to hear people say you don't deserve something, maybe you're the best in the game and you're having to hear people be really toxic about you, things like that. How do you cope? And this is what he had to say.
Okay, and your last question here is for victims of toxicity, what support is there available to them that isn't always obvious? And would I have any advice, or do I have any advice for them? Okay, so what came to my mind is like almost like what I would say is one of the most organic forms of support that we're going to get for toxicity online is I think it's to make the right friends, to make the good friends, the people we actually want to play with, that we feel good around, that we have good communications, make jokes, feel nice playing with, finding and those type of people and playing with them repeatedly, because then it's like that way you ensure that when you are gaming or having an online experience or engagement, that you're more inclined to have a positive vibe around that, like if it's a 5v5 game and four of the guys you play or people you're playing with are positive. I mean, you got a damn, your odds are pretty good at having an all-round more positive game, But I would say that, and that not only extends to like people you're playing with, right, but also like the types of content and communities that you engage with. If it was on a platform like Twitch, there's such a wide variety of streamers, right, and you can find people that are playing into all kinds of how would I say, emotional states in people. You find people that are really friendly and like small, more supportive and interactive communities. And you find people that are much more widely available, streams that are appealing to mass markets, where you're more likely to get conflicts of opinions and stuff. So it's almost like pick your content a bit more carefully. If it's YouTube, Facebook, these types of media platforms, it's I think all of us need to, how would I say, we could all stand to benefit from just valuing our own mental space or our own inner being a little bit more, and what we actually put into our minds content-wise from what we consume from social media. So I think like just watching things that make you feel good about the world and yourself, as opposed to things that leave you feeling like bitter and resentful to groups of people that you don't even know who they are, that those things really can matter, and you can kind of like already do your part to engage in better circles and stuff. And I think this almost feeds naturally into like the next one, or that I'd really like to get to for this, is that because the second part is you ask almost like for advice, and I think there's just what came to my mind, or what I really just want to say to anyone feeling like hurt, or just like a victim, or just over the whole toxicity thing. It's just it would almost just be like you still have that thing to also do a kind deed, to put out a positive thing, to be one of the people who is kind and engaging and supportive and encouraging and friendly, and doing all those things, and almost like to see from what it feels like to be on the receiving end of toxicity. We can reason from that like what we put out into the world, our messages that we put out, that they really do matter, and they do actually have a direct impact on some people's lives, on their psychology, on what they're feeling like that. So the same can be said if we flip that coin for the positive things, like we can also put out our good vibes and do those things, and even if it doesn't change the world or stop all the toxicity, it can still have a direct impact, like we say, on those people that are on the receiving end of our messages, but also through the friends we make, the people we can then recurringly engage with and stuff. And even on one level deeper than that, even just putting out those things prompts you to be in a positive a mind space, in a mindset, to have a positive attitude. If it was in spiritual terms, it would almost be to have a good karma. But like, these things really do matter for how you feel about yourself. Uh, uh, there's even always a lovely tip for how to deal with if you're feeling down, depressed, or sad. A good way to get a pick-me-up is actually to do something good for others. And it's almost like that same principle, I think, can be applied to this thing more broadly. Like, we always have that thing to just put out our good vibes and our positivity.
I think what Steven said there, and a lot of the conversation is really positive. It's about choosing your groups, and it was mentioned in the chat as well. What you consume kind of defines you as well. And the problem with gaming is that we do find ourselves in quite toxic spaces. And it was what we mentioned right at the start, where I spoke about that psychological idea of being part of the group. So when everyone's throwing out their bans and people are laughing, you also want to be funny. Or if your friends are getting quite, if your friends are complaining, maybe they're watching a player in a competition and they're like, I don't like this player because she's a woman, which I've heard before, and she doesn't belong here, or she's only here because she's a woman, which is very sexist and toxic. But they say that, and you say it too because you want to fit in maybe, or you don't say anything. And I think what Stephen mentioned there is how we have to change that, is we really do have to change our perceptions. One, we need to change who we surround ourselves with and the bubbles that we create online, because we all do have a platform, whether we like it or not now. Everyone has a space on the internet. Choose to surround yourself with stuff that doesn't anger you. So if playing with your friends triggers you because they're not as good as you, or that they are too good or whatever, don't play games with them. Just stop. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're not friends anymore. Just stop. Find somewhere else to go. If there's things that you're reading on Reddit that are making you angry and that anger is building up, stop reading them. And it's all very easy. This is so much easier said than done, because I'm someone who deals with a lot of toxicity. As we've seen today while we were trying to do Tech Girl Talks, I get this all the time. I get horrible messages. I see horrible things written about me. I hear horrible things said about me. When I'm in a game, someone, if they recognize me, will say horrible things. And it's very hard when we say, just move on. Don't surround yourself with it. Don't read it. Don't look for it. But it is difficult because sometimes it's right in your face. And there's nothing you can do. I'm doing this live stream. Other than disabling the chat, I can't stop that toxicity from coming through. And it's very hard to ignore it. So as much as I agree with Stephen on creating positive spaces, I also think that you need to create things that make you positive. And this is going to sound like super airy-fairy and whatever, but when you're getting that sort of hate, when the stream is over, you need to walk away, you need to look in the mirror, and you need to say some nice things to yourself and convince yourself of that. Or if you're dealing with it a lot and you're seeing other people do it, you need to call them out. But it is really difficult if you've been a victim of toxicity, because I know how it affects you. And like I mentioned when I had that thing about my forehead, like I'm going on about it, but it's such a good example of how it bred in and festered for a bit. And then it constantly just got worse. And this is something that I do think becomes the problem. And I'd love to know what you think the solutions are to helping people who've had to deal with toxicity, because of course it upsets you. That's the point of it. And how we can be better in the space. This is obviously the difficult question. It's not even a question I asked Stephen, because I just don't think anyone can answer it, is how do we eliminate toxicity? I don't know. I don't know how we stop it. I really don't know how we get rid of angry people online who can create these platforms where there's no repercussions for their behavior. I don't know how we stop that. I don't know how we course correct. I do think that the developers need to be stricter in games with behavior that's allowed and not allowed. And I also think, because this is specifically about esports and this is the focus from an esports point of view, is that I do think, and I've had this conversation with tournaments tournament organizers all the time, is that I want you banned. If you're toxic, banned. Don't play. That's it. Go away. Like they take their toys away, because at the end of the day, playing games, especially online and in competitive settings, that is a privilege that we have. It is a privilege. It costs a lot of money and a lot of people can't do it. It's a privilege. So if you're going to be a horrible person, your privilege should be taken away. Done. You don't get nice things. So it's also interesting because one of the other things that I saw here was the idea in the chat of just be nice. So if someone calls you a potato, you just say, yep, I'm a double potato. Do it very nicely. Apologize, because a lot of the time that toxicity stops because it's really hard to be toxic towards someone who's being nice to you. I completely agree. So remember, I spoke about this earlier as well, this idea that when people are negative to you and are toxic to you, your reaction is to be toxic back, and then you create the clash. Whereas if you were just like us, they're not getting in. So that helps, definitely. I think it's different. And again, I'm going to bring this back. I do think it's different when we're dealing with hate speech, racism, sexism, homophobia. There's no need to be nice. Like, under no circumstances should that ever be justified. There's no need for any of that. And what I think is interesting, and we're going to kind of move into this in a bit, but Queen Ara's just dropped a really interesting comment here saying her perspective as a lady in the space is that she feels we are asking the wrong questions. A lot of the bullies for women are men, and it's time that as the women stop getting asked, how do we get bullied? We need to stop asking the men in the space why they are toxic and why they are silent when they see this going on. And I completely agree with Queen Ara. We spoke about this in last week's Tech Girl Talks when we spoke about the LGBTQ community in esports, and about why at some point there needs to be a defense for marginalized groups, and it can't come from the marginalized groups. It's not fair when the marginalized group has to constantly stand up and not only deal with all of that, but then also defend it. So we need to see more people. So if you're a man and you're seeing a woman getting her fair share of toxicity, you need to stand up and defend her. Don't expect her to take on all that hurt and then fight it. If you see someone being racist towards a person of color, if you're white, stand up and fight against them. Don't make the person of color have to defend themselves on top of dealing with all that hurt. We need to be better allies. We did speak about this a lot last week, and I think it stands here. And a lot of toxicity does stem from those attacks on marginalized groups. Here we were talking more about the general toxicity in gaming, where people are just ugly. You are playing a game a lot of the time where you're shooting someone in the head. So of course there's like a weird anger and aggressiveness that comes with it. But there is also that really horrible other side of toxicity where it is someone who just wants to attack marginalized groups and be aggressive and be completely horrible because their own understanding of the world is so broken. But I think what Queen Ara said there is that's 100% right. One, always try and be positive. Meet people nice. If they want to be toxic, just be nice back, but also to a degree, but also sometimes ask the question. So you don't need to say to women, why is there so much sexism in gaming? Maybe start asking male players, why is gaming so toxic? Why are you so toxic towards marginalized groups? And maybe you're right. Maybe that is the change that we need to see. I don't have the answers. What I wanted to do today with Tech Girl Talks was I wanted to explain more of an understanding of, and again, it was a very broad topic of why we see toxicity in gaming, and then talk a little bit about how, if you've identified yourself as someone who's becoming toxic, how to fix that, and then also how to handle being a victim of toxicity. If you're feeling like you're getting a lot of toxicity, how to create spaces where you can feel safe. This is such a broad topic, and this was just one episode. I'd love to delve into this a little bit more. I'd love to talk. There's so many nuances, and it's a lot like the episode we had last week when we spoke about the LGBTQ community, is that there's just so much to dive into, to discuss, and we can't do it all in an hour. But I thought that this broad overview would potentially start a conversation, and I do hope that some of the advice that Stephen gave not only about how to identify when you're being toxic and fix it, but also how to cope if you're dealing with toxicity helps. I know that it's not nearly enough, but I hope it helps. And more importantly, I hope that I've created a safe space here with these Tech Girl Talks. We've now on episode 5, and the idea here was to create a community where, for those of us that love esports, could sit and talk about the real issues together in a positive space where we could talk about them, share solutions, share advice, and be supportive and try and grow the community. I don't want to sit here and be controversial. I don't want to sit here and be flaming. I wanted to sit here and say, here's the problem and here's some potential solutions for us. How do we get to work? Because this is a space that we love. We can talk for days about how toxic gaming is, but we also want to play games. And I'm hoping that at least with Tech Girl Talks, maybe we were able to do that. And while I've only brushed the surface of toxicity in gaming, this is something that I'm really hoping we can dive into in a future episode. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode of Tech Girl Talks. I'm seriously considering turning this into a podcast series as well. If that's something that you would love to listen to, let me know in the comments below. And of course, if you have any questions, any thoughts about the discussion that we had, you can drop those into the comments and I will reply. If you want to have a live conversation with me, make sure that you join the Twitch chat at 1 p.m. SAST every Wednesday. I am going to be taking a break next week, but episodes will resume after that. And you can also join my Discord. There's a link in the description to this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure you give it a thumbs up. Obviously, I'd love it if you could subscribe and hit that notification bell, and I'll see you soon.